Hi, Scarlet Marvel here. With the recent release of comic one-shot Fallen Friend, The Death of Miss Marvel, I started to think about the many death of comics that Marvel has produced over the years. This category of comics explores the circumstances around a specific superhero's death, including how it happened and or its effects on the hero's loved ones. Ever since the death of Captain Marvel in 1982, Marvel's released many comics under this branding, with the 2010s making Death of comics a near biannual occurrence. As I thought about this fascinating category of comics, I started to wonder which ones would have been the best. So I decided to make a tier list, ranking all of Marvel's Death of comics. Join me to find out which is my personal favorite, and let me know which one is your favorite down in the comments below. In 1982, Marvel released The Death of Captain Marvel, which was groundbreaking, not only as Marvel's first graphic novel, but mainly for showcasing the first major death of a mainstream superhero in American comics. This story is quite mature, as Marvel's original Captain Marvel doesn't die in combat, as might be expected, but rather, he dies from cancer, showing that superheroes can be just as vulnerable as ordinary people. Captain Marvel's send-off is incredibly emotional, as the entire Marvel universe pays their respects to the hero. Even Thanos, Captain Marvel's main nemesis, showed his admiration for the hero by guiding him towards death through spiritual combat, allowing Captain Marvel to, at least mentally, go out fighting as a hero. This comic is truly some of Jim Starlin's best work, holding up even today, and its impact has been immense, with Captain Marvel being one of Marvel's biggest and only superheroes to remain dead. Additionally, this comic's success kept Marvel on the path towards more mature stories, and kickstarted the trend of highlighting superhero deaths in comics that continued with The Death of Superman in 1993. With all this being said, The Death of Captain Marvel solidly earns its spot at the top of the list in S tier. For the next couple decades, Marvel took a break from Death of comics, with the exception of two other comics that had similar premises of highlighting a death in title and story, although not necessarily the death of a major superhero. In 1989, Marvel released the graphic novel Squadron Supreme: Death of a Universe, which served as the conclusion to Mark Gruenwald's Squadron Supreme storyline. In this comic, the Squadron Supreme, who occupy a universe separate from Marvel's main continuity, attempted to save their universe from destruction in a storyline quite similar to DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths, referencing the Squadron Supreme's origin as Marvel's pastiche of the Justice League. Despite failing to stop the destruction of their universe, the Squadron Supreme are able to resurrect it, but become trapped in the mainline Marvel universe in the process, thus signifying a major change to their status quo. I'm not a big fan of the Squadron Supreme, but this is a solid story. However, it's so different from other comics on this list that it feels strange to rank it against the others, so I'll place it in C tier, for comics that I enjoy, but that don't exactly fit the theme of the list. In 2006, Marvel released the one-shot comic Fantastic Four: A Death in the Family, which is the second comic that doesn't fully fit in with the theme of the list. While a Fantastic Four member, the Invisible Woman, does die in this issue, it's eventually revealed that the death actually happened in an alternate universe that's never seen again. The surprise of the issue is that the mainline Fantastic Four members are protected from experiencing the same death by the alternate universe Human Torch, who used time travel to protect his alternate reality sister. This makes for an interesting story about death and fate, but due to the titular death being from an alternate universe never again seen, the story ends up being forgettable and unimpactful, especially when considering the sheer number of times that members of the mainline Fantastic Four have died and come back. For all these reasons, this comic takes a spot at the bottom of C tier. In 2007, 25 years after the death of Captain Marvel, Marvel released Fallen Sun: The Death of Captain America, a 5-issue miniseries dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War crossover event. Shortly after surrendering to Iron Man, Captain America was killed by Crossbones and a brainwashed Sharon Carter at Red Skull's command. This incident is depicted and explored in Captain America's self-titled series, while the Death of Captain America comic instead focuses on the reactions of Wolverine, Clint Barton, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the Avengers. Each issue of the series represents one of the 5 stages of grief, allowing for a clever examination of how heroes, and people in general, mourn in different ways. I read this series early on in my comic reading journey, so I feel a strong connection to it. I consider it Marvel's best exploration of the emotional impact of a hero's death on the greater Marvel universe, and it beautifully emphasized the legacy and importance of Captain America, in a way that made me like the character much more than before. The only true downside to the comic is that the impact was short-lived, as Captain America was revived only 2 years later. However, there is more than enough reason to place this series alongside the Death of Captain Marvel in S tier. Following the massive success of Fallen Sun, the Death of Captain America, Marvel decided to produce Death of comics at a much faster pace. Beginning with 2010's 2-issue miniseries, Hercules, Fall of an Avenger. This comic follows the events of the Incredible Hercules series, which ended with the titular character's supposed death, leaving his young friend Amadeus Cho as the new Prince of Power. The first issue does an excellent job of paying tribute to Hercules' long history in the Marvel Universe, with many characters from his past returning to pay their respects. The second issue focuses on Amadeus Cho, as he adjusts to his new role while searching for a way to resurrect Hercules, ultimately discovering that he's still alive. This short series is quite good, serving as an emotional summary of Hercules' Marvel history, and as a solid starting point for a new era in Hercules and Amadeus Cho's journeys. However, the fact that Hercules is confirmed to be alive in the second issue does take away much of the series' impact, so Hercules Fall of an Avenger earns a spot in the B tier. Also in 2010, Marvel released the one-shot comic, Sentry Fallen Sun. This story dealt with the aftermath of Sentry's death at the end of the Siege crossover event. Within the comic, the heroes of the Marvel Universe attend Sentry's funeral, each sharing the ways that Sentry had helped them in the past. Despite being introduced relatively recently, Sentry was inserted into much of Marvel's history through many retcons, so Sentry Fallen Sun featured even more retcons to further expand his connections to Marvel's heroes. The retcons surrounding Sentry's introduction mostly worked well to provide him with an interesting origin story, but the retcons revealed at his funeral are, at best, unimpactful, and at worst, a disservice to the characters involved. These retcons are meant to deepen the impact Sentry had on the Marvel Universe, but instead they become distracting and off-putting due to the ways that they contradict or devalue several hero stories. Additionally, this issue fails to make me care about Sentry, a character I'm already not too interested in, so Sentry Fallen Sun takes a spot at the bottom of the list in D tier. "2010 was a big year for Marvel deaths, as the company released yet another Death of comic, this time starring a villain, although one who has been the protagonist of his own comic on several occasions. The one-shot comic, Death of Dracula, explored the circumstances leading up to Dracula's death at the hands of his son, Zarus. Unlike other Death of comics that serve as endpoints, this comic acts as a starting point for Marvel's vampire stories in the 2010s, leading directly into the Curse of the Mutants crossover event. As such, the Death of Dracula isn't focused on making the reader grieve for Dracula, but it's instead focused on introducing new concepts regarding Marvel's vampires and setting up Zarus as a prominent villain. In this aspect, the comic serves its purpose quite well, and even features some epic action, but due to the lack of any emotional connection, it's hard to truly care about the issue's events. So, although it succeeds at its goal of rebooting Marvel's Vampire Corner, the Death of Dracula takes a spot at the bottom of B tier. In 2011, Marvel's mainline universe took a break from Death of comics, with the Ultimate Marvel universe featuring one instead, in the form of 6-issue limited series Ultimate Fallout, which mainly dealt with the aftermath of Spider-Man's death at the conclusion of Ultimate Spider-Man, but also served as a relaunch for the entire Ultimate Marvel universe. The series consisted of several short stories, starring a large number of Ultimate Marvel characters, mostly exploring their reactions to the death of Spider-Man. The most famous of these short stories was the introduction of Miles Morales, aka the new Ultimate Spider-Man, who soon became a very popular character in his own right, and is one of my personal favorite superheroes. Ultimate Fallout is similar to the death of Captain America, as it compellingly shows the emotional repercussions that a hero's death can have on the entire Marvel universe. However, there are some downsides to this comic, including the lack of consistent focus, with a few non-Spider-Man related stories awkwardly included to tease future storylines, the lack of long-term stakes, as Spider-Man would be resurrected about 3 years later, and the fact that this takes place in the Ultimate Marvel universe, which I don't have a strong connection to. Overall, the series is still quite good, and earns a spot at the bottom of A tier. In 2014, Death returned to the mainline Marvel universe with The Death of Wolverine. This became Marvel's first Death of comic to double as its own crossover event, with the 4-issue Death of Wolverine miniseries being accompanied by several tie-in issues under the same branding. The 4-issue miniseries dealt with the actual death and circumstances leading up to it, with Wolverine losing his regenerative abilities and facing many of his past enemies as they try to kill him. Ultimately, this leads Wolverine to Dr. Cornelius, the man who originally experimented on him as part of the Weapon X program. Wolverine destroys the program, kills Dr. Cornelius, and loses his life in the process. This story does become confusing and convoluted, as author Charles Soule attempts to include as much of Wolverine's past as he can. But it ends in a deeply cathartic way, as Wolverine finds closure after defeating his greatest enemies. The tie-in issues are the icing on the cake, as they demonstrate the deep impact that Wolverine had on his closest allies, such as Captain America, Spider-Man, and the X-Men. Although I'm not the biggest fan of Wolverine, I can admit that this is a respectable and satisfying story to close out the life of one of Marvel's most iconic superheroes. So, The Death of Wolverine deserves its spot in the A tier. In 2016, the Marvel Universe found itself in the middle of the Civil War II crossover event, with Hulk becoming one of the event's most surprising casualties. To honor his legacy, one-shot issue The Fallen was released as a tie-in to Civil War II. This issue focused on Hulk's closest allies, Rick Jones, Betty Ross, and the Warbound, as they attend Hulk's funeral, deal with their own grief, and visit the 4 other Hulks to help them with their emotions. This is a very sorrowful issue, as we see the immense love Hulk's allies had for him, cleverly juxtaposed against the hatred he experienced from the general public. Very few people attended his funeral, showing how lonely Hulk was. But we also get a look at the family he'd found in his allies, made more poignant when a pre-recorded Bruce Banner reads his own emotional will. This issue explores grief quite well, particularly the anger that comes from grief. And it serves as a tragic, but powerful send-off for Marvel's Green Goliath. So, The Fallen takes a spot near the top of B tier, only truly held back by its brevity. Also in 2016, Marvel released 4-issue miniseries Death of X, which served as a prelude to the Inhumans vs. X-Men crossover event. The titular X refers to the X-Men, or rather, mutants as a whole, since the story deals with the revelation that the Terrigen Clouds, which are creating new Inhumans, are deadly to mutants, threatening to kill out the entire species. Within the series, Cyclops and Storm attempted to solve the Terrigen threat, with Storm trying to reason with the Inhumans, while Cyclops took a confrontational approach that ended in his supposed death. The big surprise of this series is that Cyclops had actually died in the very first issue, when he was exposed to the Terrigen. The Cyclops seen in later issues was a psychic projection created by Emma Frost, who refused to let Cyclops' death be in vain. While this comic had an intriguing premise, it ended up falling flat in many ways, with several characters and plot points feeling underdeveloped. Still, this comic came out relatively early in my comic reading career, and I was a big fan of both the X-Men and Inhumans. So I still found the series quite exciting, and formed a strong connection to it. Because of this, Death of X takes a spot at the top of B tier. Speaking of Inhumans, they soon followed in the X-Men's footsteps, starring in 2018's 5-issue miniseries, Death of the Inhumans. This story comes after 5 years of the Inhumans being pushed as a major part of the Marvel Universe, with many new Inhumans being introduced in the process. Despite this push, the Inhumans never gained the popularity that Marvel hoped for, likely leading to Death of the Inhumans. This story involved a confusing Kree-alien plan to enslave the Inhumans that ended with King Black Bolt being forced to kill practically all members of his species. This essentially undid a large part of the Inhumans' 5 years in the spotlight, upsetting fans of that era, such as myself. Additionally, the storyline wasn't even good, being overly graphic in its gratuitous violence, and feeling incredibly disrespectful to the character arcs developed over the previous 5 years. To make matters worse, at the time of recording, this series remains the Inhumans' most recent appearance, despite the fact that the most prominent Inhumans remained alive. This comic's only redeeming quality is the excellent artwork by Ariel Olivetti, but that's not enough to save Death of the Inhumans from a spot in the lowest tier, D tier. In 2018, Marvel released the Infinity Wars crossover event, announcing that a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy would sacrifice their life during the event and be honored in 2019's one-shot Infinity Wars Fallen Guardian. Ultimately, Drax sacrificed his life to undo the chaos caused by his teammate Gamora in her surprise turn to villainy. The Fallen Guardian comic then dealt with the aftermath of Drax's death, as the remaining Guardians mourned and reflected on Drax's life. Mainly, this issue serves as a summary of Drax's life, with emphasis on his origin story. This makes it an effective epilogue for Infinity Wars, as it adds deeper context to his sacrifice, which involved reconnecting with his original human form, Arthur Douglas. Overall, however, this issue is quite underwhelming, as the Guardians' team dynamic, which makes them interesting to read, is entirely fractured by Gamora's betrayal and Drax's death, making the issue rather bland and forgettable. So, Infinity Wars Fallen Guardian takes a spot near the bottom of B tier. In 2021, the Death of Doctor Strange crossover event was released, with the main story taking place in the Death of Doctor Strange 5-issue miniseries, which was written as a murder mystery. Specifically, it told the story of a past version of Doctor Strange, preserved by magic, solving the mystery of his own death in the present day. This made for a unique Death of comic that was more fun to read, as it didn't focus on the tragic aspects of death. Additionally, the tie-in issues highlighted the physical repercussions of Doctor Strange's death, rather than the emotional repercussions that these type of comics usually focus on. This emphasized the importance of Doctor Strange's role as the Sorcerer Supreme, since his mere presence protected the world from a variety of mystical threats that began emerging after his death. This series is an incredibly fresh and innovative approach to Death of comics that revitalized the category after several subpar entries, making for an enjoyable read that kept me engaged the entire time. The only downsides are the slightly confusing storyline and the fact that Doctor Strange came back to life less than a year later. Overall, the Death of Doctor Strange earns its spot at the top of A tier. Lastly, we've made it to 2023, and the recent release of one-shot Fallen Friend, The Death of Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel's death in Amazing Spider-Man earlier this year was notoriously poorly executed, and Miss Marvel happens to be one of my absolute favorite superheroes, so I was quite worried about the Death of Miss Marvel one-shot. However, This issue celebrated Miss Marvel's legacy in the best way possible. The connections she created as Kamala, a champion, and an Avenger are all highlighted excellently, with this issue clearly pointing out what makes Miss Marvel unique in the Marvel Universe. Her leadership skills, unwavering dedication to her friends, and passion for always doing good are all emphasized in a beautiful funeral that brought together characters from every section of her life. This was a better issue than I could have imagined, and it made me very emotional to read, but in a cathartic way that reminded me of all the reasons why Miss Marvel's one of my favorite superheroes. The issue could have made the S tier, but it's kept down by the poorly realized circumstances of her death, and the fact that she's already been announced to return only a month after this issue is published, lowering its overall impact. Still, Fallen Friend, The Death of Miss Marvel earns a spot near the top of A tier. Looking at my completed tier list, it's interesting to see how Marvel's Death of comics have evolved over the years. Some of the earliest entries remain the best, but several new ones have approached similar quality. And there continues to be strong innovation that proves the concept is far from stale. That being said, the number of Death of comics continues to increase at a fast pace that could be detrimental to their impact, as evidenced by some dips in quality. Still, I'm looking forward to reading more of these comics in the years to come, as I'm fascinated by the explorations of mature topics like grief, legacy, and loss. But in the meantime, I've enjoyed looking back at and ranking Marvel's already existing Death of comics. Of course, this is all just my opinion, and I encourage you to read through the comics yourselves to form your own opinions. As always, I've had a lot of fun with this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and thanks for joining me. If you liked this video, why don't you check out my other tier list, the tier list of Marvel superhero teams up here. Otherwise, check out any of the other Marvelous videos on this channel, and have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining me. Bye!